Welcome to Bear in Mind. I'm your host, Chancellor Bob Berdahl. We're coming to you from our television studio at the University of California, Berkeley, where we're joined by a small audience of students, faculty, and staff. Bear in Mind, which also appears on the UC Berkeley website, is a monthly conversation with some of the most interesting and informed people here on the Berkeley campus. On this edition, we'll be talking to Erich Gruen and David Wake, this year's faculty research lecturers, Tom Leonard, University Librarian on the Library in the Digital Age, and law student Jean Galbraith on being editor-in-chief of the California Law Review. So stay tuned for this edition of Bear in Mind. Our first two guests are this year's faculty research lecturers. The faculty research lecture is an old tradition at Berkeley dating back to 1912 when the first faculty lecturers were selected by the Faculty Senate. Since that time, each year, the Faculty Senate selects the faculty research lecturers, probably the most distinguished honor that a faculty member can receive from the faculty here at Berkeley, to be chosen for this presentation. And we're joined today by Erich Gruen and David Wake. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Erich, let's start with you. What are you going to be talking about at your lecture?
Well, the title of the lecture is The Jew and the Other, Alienation or Integration. And it's part of a larger research project that I've been engaged in for a bit that has to deal with intercultural relations among peoples and nations and ethnic groups in the Mediterranean world of antiquity. A topic that I was drawn to because the ancient Mediterranean is, in my view, a kind of the multicultural world par excellence, in which the interconnections and engagements with one another constitute really a central element in the development of these various peoples. But precisely because of this multicultural world, this polyglot universe, it became all the more important for each of these groups to establish a separate identity, to establish their own distinctiveness from everybody else, to show how their qualities, traditions, values were better than anybody else. And so we get dichotomies like the Jew and the Gentile, or the Greek and the barbarian, or the effete Easterner and the uncultivated Westerner, in order to separate out one culture from another. What I'm trying to do, and this lecture is, as I say, part of that larger enterprise, is to show that the interconnections among these peoples are far more important than, in forming their own identity, than their effort at distinctiveness. In other words, that these peoples were buying into other people's cultures rather than isolating them.
When you say buying into other people's cultures,
well,
exactly what does that mean?
Okay, it means that they had no hesitation in appropriating traditions and legends from other peoples and incorporating them into their own sense of themselves. For example, instead of speaking just in abstractions, perhaps the most famous example is the Roman tradition that the Roman people stemmed from Aeneas, the Trojan refugee. By doing so, the Romans were essentially buying into the central myth of Greek antiquity by associating themselves with Trojans, who were a mythological people. And there are many examples of this sort. I mean, there is a tradition that the Jews and the Spartans stemmed from the same ancestor. And who was that ancestor? Abraham. There is a tradition...
Seems to be the ancestor of a whole lot of people.
Of a whole lot of people. But the fact that the Jews wanted to associate him with the Spartans is an indication that they were buying into a kind of Spartan tradition of the warrior mentality, the sense of ability to endure suffering and adherence to the law and so on and so forth. So this kind of, that's what I mean by buying it.
Very interesting. David, what are you going to be lecturing on?
Well, I'm interested in how biological diversity comes about. And I've spent my career studying how lineages of organisms diversify. So I'm going to be focusing on questions of species, how species arise, what species are, and how we can combine studies of pattern and process to gain a general understanding of biological diversity in the world today.
You're not calling your lecture The Origin of the Species, by chance?
No, I'm not. I'm not, actually. But ironically, Darwin, who wrote a famous book on the origin of species, well over 100 years ago, 150 years ago almost, really avoided saying anything about what species were. And this has been a very difficult problem in biology ever since. It's been one of these problems of having an ancient word that we carry into modern science, and then we have to reify this word in some way. And so this leads us into all kinds of interesting problems that are not only scientific but philosophical in nature.
Well, when you talk about species, how do you define species then?
I define species as a chunk of a genealogical nexus that is something that is real in present time. If we place it into broad time perspective, is a continuum. It's like the paradox of Gladys. You can and you cannot throw a rock in the same river twice.
In the same river twice.
And this is very apt for what species, how species are perceived in modern times.
And are species undergoing change today?
They are, but the biggest change that's affecting species is their demise. Biological evolution is relatively slow. Extinction in the past was relatively slow. So there was a kind of origination-extinction balance. Now we're facing something that is unprecedented, and that is horrifyingly rapid extinction rates. Paradoxically, at the same time that we're facing these extinction rates, we're discovering species at a very rapid rate because there's been such a focus on amphibians as kind of bellwethers of the environment that many people have been out searching in areas that were previously relatively poorly known, like Madagascar or like parts of the Amazon. And the rate of species discovery has been astonishingly high. We found 40% increase in numbers of amphibians since 1985.
Well,
so these are vertebrates.
So should people be worried then that we're discovering new species while some are going extinct?
Yes, they should. Because, to give you an example, I work on little mountaintops in Mexico. And virtually every mountaintop is turning out to have a unique species. And in the past, we'd go to one place, we'd find a species there, and then we'd extrapolate. Well, this must be the species that occurs in this whole region.
But they're actually different species on different mountaintops.
Yes,
and they evolve differently because of geographic separation.
They do, and because of geographic separation, and that means if they're geographically separated, there are small environmental differences in each of these areas, and furthermore, because they're isolated by themselves, a process known as genetic drift ensues, and given enough time, groups of organisms will differentiate.
I want to ask each of you a kind of final question, because we're in a university that is so remarkably broad in its perspective, and yet all we hear about these days is sort of the need for universities to contribute to economic development. And And each of you are in areas that one might seem to think wouldn't have that component as a part of a university. One might see ancient history and the classics as sort of antiquarian, or the study of these obscure species as having very little to do with contemporary life. Tell me why what you do is important, Erich.
Important for economic development?
No,
Bob?
important for a university.
Well, as you know, in teaching large classes of undergraduates, we're dealing with a very small proportion of those who are actually going to go on in our field. But we are dealing with a substantial number of people who are going to go out into the world, in California and the nation and elsewhere, for whom we hope we are inculcating certain critical intellectual tools that will enable them to read more perceptively, be much more aware of the deceptions and the misleading information that they have to grapple with, so that the particular field that we're in is, in some ways, at least at the undergraduate level, certainly less important than the rigor which we hope to instill into the whole intellectual enterprise, no matter what field these people go into.
David, how would you answer that same question?
I could answer it in several ways, but I think probably the most appropriate would be to focus on organisms as part of our world, the world in which we live. And these organisms are surrogates in many respects. They're out there. By studying them, we're learning something about ourselves as well.
The way you've described them, they're almost the canary in the mine shaft.
Well, that's an interesting commentary. You see that often said, but it's really not appropriate for the amphibians or even for us, because for this reason, when the miners took a canary into the coal mine with them and the canary died, the miners left. Mm-hmm. But where are we going to go?
We can't leave.
So one of the things that's happening, for example, with global climate change, which has been a hard sell, scientists have been discussing this for a couple of, well, almost 2 decades now, and yet it's been a very hard political sell. And we know what's happening now because these mountaintop salamanders that I've been talking about, as climate changes, the cloud line is rising. Mm-hmm. They're being forced right off the top.
Their environment is changing.
They're being forced right off the top of the mountain. They're looking for the clouds, which are now, right on maybe the top 150 meters of the mountain is covered with clouds. And as they go up, they just start getting shoved right off the top of the mountain, literally. Well, we've got something to learn from them.
Yeah. I would thank you, Erich and David, for being on Bear in Mind.
Thank you.
The Berkeley campus has a wonderful university library. It is a fantastic resource housing over 9 million volumes, including some of the oldest collections on the West Coast. And our library is recognized not only for its size, but for the range of its holdings. In fact, the Association of Research Libraries ranked the University of California Berkeley Library 3rd in the nation among university libraries, just behind Harvard and Yale, as among the very top university libraries in the world. Tom Leonard, our next guest, is the Kenneth and Dorothy Hill University Librarian and professor in the Graduate School of Journalism. Tom, welcome to Bear in Mind.
Thank you for having me.
Well, now tell me, what is so special about having a library of this size? Why should we worry about it? We've got the internet. We have all kinds of sources of information.
It's a good question, and you know, I think libraries used to be evaluated just on the basis of how much stuff they had, but we're really moving into an era where we want to know about the impact and the result, especially the result on learning. And you know, whether you look at a library as a physical place or you might say a psychological effect, it has an enormous effect on learning. My guess is that everybody who comes to campus, either as a freshman next fall or as an entering graduate student, will have this sort of shock and awe moment when they enter our library. And it's built to give you that. If you walk into Doe, you're meant to be purified. You know, you enter the north entrance with its Greek statuary, you ascend a marble staircase, and you arrive in a large room with books and now computer screens. You've left the street and the city and you're ready for a different kind of an experience. And all the great libraries of that era are theater in that respect. Mm-hmm. And then your social life as a graduate student or a freshman is going to be importantly centered around the library. At least that's my hope, and actually it's the reality, especially in the evenings. Mm-hmm. And you're going to see people learning. You're going to see a range of literature or a range sometimes of websites that you wouldn't have known about unless you made that journey.
When was it built? In the 20s?
Well, they started in about 1908, I think that our cornerstone says 1910. It really opened a few years later. But sure, and we're coming on. We're not too far from the centennial of that facility really opening.
Now tell me, we read a lot in the press these days, and those of us in university administration are certainly aware of the fact that we have a great problem with journal costs going up. Can you tell us something about what's causing that, why that is, how we're going to be able to deal with it?
Yeah, it is something that should keep us up nights. And in fact, when Professor Wake was talking about the 5,700 species of amphibians and numbers growing all the time, what I was thinking about are the new titles and new journals devoted to that, which perhaps in his field are sponsored by scholarly societies, but which I suspect are going to be sponsored by rapacious international information corporations who have found that it is a very good business to be in, to sell content, as we call it, scholarship, that professors give for free back to the university for prices that would astound a sort of ordinary citizen of the state of California.
Tell me about some of the special collections that we have in this library that make it unique.
Right. Well, it will come as no surprise to you that Berkeley is an excellent place to go if you want to study film. Harvard's library, the Library of Congress, is better in many respects in print, I have to say. But if you wanted to study contemporary film or historical film, you would be better off in Berkeley than you would be in Cambridge, for example. We also have outstanding special collections. These are rare and unique materials. And I know you've taught a freshman seminar that used the Bancroft Library. We have the Mark Twain papers. We have this great treasure trove of classical papyrus, or at least from the classical era, that is the largest collection in North America taken from a single source. And
when was that acquired?
It was acquired at the turn of the century when Phoebe Apperson Hearst had the good sense to employ some British archaeologists, and they found, as I say, this kind of treasure trove. They initially didn't quite know what they had, you might say, found. They had found a cemetery of mummified crocodiles. It wasn't, I believe, quite what they were looking for, but they quickly understood that these dead animals, I know it's funny how we're coming back to amphibians, these dead animals were preserved or wrapped in papyrus, or at least inside the bodies. And this, was a range of writing on a variety of topics, some literary and more, I believe more, on the economics and the ordinary business affairs of the classical world. And so today, for that matter, freshmen, but also very advanced students, are still inventorying and reading this material. And it seems like a very far distance from the modern digital library, which is the direction we're going.
Well, I've always believed that the mark of a great university was a great library, and this university certainly has one. And you're doing a wonderful job of seeing to it that it continues to have that, Tom. We're very, very grateful to you for that, and pleased to have you on Bear in Mind.
Thank you
for
very
being
much.
here. Good. That was Tom Leonard, University Librarian, University of California, Berkeley Library. Our next guest is a third-year law student at Bolt Hall, Jean Galbraith, and she is currently the editor-in-chief of the California Law Review and looking forward to beginning her clerkship with the Federal Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. this summer. Her name is Jean Galbraith. Jean, welcome to Bear in Mind.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about how you got to Berkeley. Where did you do your undergraduate work? What did you do following that?
I did my undergraduate work at Harvard, and after that I went and spent 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa, where I had what might be called the classic Peace Corps experience. I lived in a small rural village, and I taught mostly school children, but also some adult literacy.
And what did you majored in at Harvard?
I studied social studies, which is political theory, and also comparative religion.
Had you always intended to go to law school?
It had been in the back of my mind, but my time in the Gambia, I think, crystallized why I wanted to do that.
In what ways?
Well, 2 ways mainly. First, I had a lot of time to read, and the books I most enjoyed reading had lawyers as their heroes. Strange thought, but
Well, were you reading Grisham, or were you reading more serious stuff?
Well, I think I read a little bit of both. But some of the more serious stuff, I read a fantastic biography of John Adams.
Okay.
And that he became a real hero for me, not just as a president and a constitutional leader, but as someone who took his place as a lawyer very seriously. He represented the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, for example, even though that was a very unpopular thing to do. And then the second type of experience in Africa was my feeling there of how lacking there were of legal structures. So if in the village where I lived, there was a fairly corrupt police department, and there was very little that the villagers could do about it. And here, by contrast, there is at least a process for dealing with that kind of problem, even if it doesn't work very effectively all or even most of the time. And I came to think of that process as perhaps one of the most wonderful things about our society.
And really central to having civilized society in a refined sense.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Well, Jean, tell us about your year as editor of the Law Review.
Well, it's been a very exciting year. Legal scholarship, as I'm sure you know, is unique in that many of the major law journals are entirely student-run. And so the student...
It's a very unusual format for professional journals, because law professors publish in them, but students edit them.
Exactly. It's a historical anomaly, basically, and it's one that provokes very mixed feelings. There are people who think it's very valuable because the students are able to give a very rigorous editing process and bring a fresh eye to selection. And then there are people that feel students have very little business in determining what scholarship should be published. So it's controversial, but
it's probably the faculty that believe the latter and the students that believe the former.
That is a fair generalization.
Okay. Well, what particular were there special issues that came up, articles or central issues that you focused on during your tenure as editor?
Well, one thing that's interesting was to hear Professor Leonard speak about the libraries in the electronic age just a few minutes ago. I mean, we're trying to wrestle with that issue ourselves about whether we can afford to be freely available online. We receive no funding from the university. And
None at all?
No, we receive space, which is a wonderful thing.
So everything is supported by subscription?
It's by subscription and by support from large corporations that specialize in information dissemination.
How much time did it take to edit this? It must have been a terribly demanding job.
I probably spent about 30 hours a week doing it, some weeks more, some weeks less.
And it's totally volunteer?
It's totally volunteer.
And you maintained a full class load in addition?
I maintained a full class load. I didn't give as much attention to my studies as I did my first 2 years.
Well, you must have done pretty well because you're going off to be clerking in a federal appeals court.
Yeah, I'm very excited for that.
Tell us a little bit about that and what that will entail. Will that be a lot like being editor of a law review in the sense that you're having to generate opinions and working with a judge in writing opinions? Will the law review editorship help you a lot in doing that?
I think it will, to the extent that I'm relying, my legal research and analytic skills have developed in the last year significantly. On the other hand, it's a very different experience. Cases tend to be much more practical in focus than scholarship. And that's particularly true now as opposed to 50 years ago, as the scholarship becomes more interdisciplinary and less focused on practitioners. And also, it's a very isolating experience, clerking in a lot of ways. It's you and the judge and the written record and material. Whereas the law review, what I've done there, has involved a lot of management. And there are about 100 students that work on it.
Well, what do you expect to do when you finish clerking? Do you want to go to work for a firm then, do you think, and practice law? What kind of law do you want to practice?
I don't know yet.
You don't know?
I would like to do something that brings in scholarship and teaching and policy work.
Okay.
And whether that's at a firm or more likely somewhere else, I can't tell yet.
All right. Well, good luck. I think you're off to a great start and are going to have a wonderful career ahead of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being on Bear in Mind. That was Jean Galbraith, third-year law student and editor-in-chief of the California Law Review.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.